welcome to the Maiden Romance podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Bailey, and we also have my co-host, Sab, aka SR7.
Hey everyone.
And today we have our very first guest on the show. Welcome, E J Dawson.
Hello, very delighted to be here. Thank you so much, Sarah and Sab. I'm absolutely delighted to be your first guest.
Well, we're delighted to have you.
Yes, definitely. We're looking forward to it for a while.
So, on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about genre crossovers in romance. So, that means romance with genres like sci-fi, paranormal, fantasy, and so on, which is quite exciting as writers, I think, to write in multiple genres in the same book. The first thing I'm going to ask, put the question out there, is why do we write genre crossovers? Does anyone want to pick up that question?
Look, I'm more than happy to. I'm just about to publish my sci-fi paranormal. It feels weird to have a sci-fi paranormal because you think that sci-fi sort of encompasses enough on its own with the fact that you have to insert all this new technology. But the story that I've written has a main character who can see when everyone will die, which is more of a psychic power. It kind of puts it in that paranormal bracket and leaves it sci-fi enough that I can leave it as it is. But what helps is that the main character is 3,000 years in the future from her own time. So I think that provided you put the work in, melding those cross genres is easy, but also good. It's exciting. It's something new to explore.
It's very true.
I think it sounds so cool.
It does.
I mean, no, really. I mean, I'm genuinely looking forward to reading it.
Psst, I'm in the middle of reading it, and it's very good so far.
Oh, thanks. I'm very flattered. I was trying to use an example that I could associate with that positively. I mean, there's a lot of fiction out there that does the same thing, that mixes genre. And paranormal is probably one of the biggest genres that tends to dip into something other than it is. So it can be urban or fantasy or sci-fi. Paranormal and psychic powers tends to fall into something that's very more broad spectrum. But what I also find about mixing genres with romance is that a lot of the time, provided that there is a love story as its key base, you can do pretty much anything in the romance genre, which makes it a wonderful place to play.
I completely agree. That's why I love romance, because you can just have the love story and then you can put it in any backdrop. Hence why I originally started writing paranormal romance myself. Mostly because of a love of vampires, but we won't go into that too much.
Oh, that is a rabbit hole I will happily go into any day.
Which was weird to think that I didn't write romance first, but yeah, no, I agree. I think that crossing over genres is really interesting, especially with romance, because obviously this is a romance podcast, so that's why we're talking about it. So I know that Sab crosses over her books with romance with fantasy.
Right, yeah. So basically, I mean, so back way when, I just was completely inspired to write my own romance, but I just didn't want it to be just any other ordinary contemporary romance, because I have a massive love for G and pirates and adventure. So and steampunk. Oh, steampunk.
Ooh, steampunk.
I just created something. Wasn't quite sure what to call it at first, where romance just thrown into this world where gods existed. There was a hell of a lot of steampunk. Everything was steampunk. And we have a little bit of magic thrown in there. So yes, fantasy romance. And I absolutely love it. And I think for me, it's just having that freedom to go wild and create this world that is solely, and there's no rule or anyone say what's right or wrong, because you're just completely in control. And yeah, I love it. But I mean, I remember, I think it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, I can't really remember, where I wasn't quite sure as to whether this story that I was writing or this series was mainly steampunk. And I had a bit of an altercation with somebody who was all about steampunk, and they kind of tore into me about what the world that I created, and it kind of really set me back. But I think I wouldn't necessarily call my story as a steampunk, just solely steampunk. I think it's got that wonderful sprinkling of steampunk elements thrown into the world, which I'd like to think that readers can envision and be transported to and see in their minds when they read the story. But I guess we'll see. But yeah, I adore genre crossovers. I really do.
And that's what I actually like about steampunk. I think steampunk is probably one of the most underrated literary genres that you can actually find, and I think that there is a lot of steampunk romance out there that is actually more plot driven. So there's a lot of books that say, oh, it's a big it's got a big story arc to it, and it's got a lot of action or mystery or crime or whatever all these genres are, but underneath all of them is still this thread of romance. And the only difference between all those other books that exist and all their other genres and romance is that the romance is brought to the foreground rather than being a background. And I honestly love that about the romance genre, because it implies that a basic human need takes precedence over everything else that we think matters. And I think that that's one of the things that annoys me when people are quite often to dismiss or judge the romance genre as being trite or inconsequential, because they're devaluing how important those connections that we are, but also finding life partners, people who make us happy, but that connection with just another person can be. And that's what I love about the steampunk, especially because it often has steampunk, I find, is probably one of the most plot centric, not character, not sex scenes, not romance, plot centric genres out there. It just happens that the romance is in equal measure with the plot. And I often find that kind of fiction much more engaging than a lot of other fiction where they sideline the romance interest into a convenient plot device or chance to just add some spice to the story. I think that's where steampunk really excels itself, because it's not selling short that connection you can feel to someone else, but more importantly how motivated people are by a attraction they have to another person.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with it. It kind of makes me feel a little bit happier.
No, sweetheart, believe you me, I have a so very long story short, I have what I like to call a steam flavored fantasy series called The Last Prophecy that's on the back burner, because I have a very, very, very good editor for this series. He's also really expensive, and so it's on the background a little bit, but I like writing that and there is romance elements in a lot of the plots, and certainly love interests, but I don't call it a romance, I call it a steam flavored fantasy, because romance doesn't take a more dominant role in it. That doesn't mean that romance isn't in it, because I think, like I've said before, romance and finding attractions to other characters plays such an important role in everyday adventure, everyday people, that you can't not have it in any story. And that's one of the key things that annoys me about this idea of caging things inside of genres. It implies that romance isn't in pretty much every single book you read. It is. It's the most maligned genre, and it is the most dominant genre, all in the same breath.
This is very true, and it also does annoy how romance is kind of seen as like really trashy. Oh, people only read it, it's like smut, blah 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 blah. And I'm like, nah, well, it can be, but a lot of it isn't. And yeah, you're writing a romance and you write sex in it, but it's more about the characters and how they engage with each other. And if you miss out romance, you're basically missing out one hugely important part of the human experience, love. And who doesn't? Well, most people in the world want to find the person they love, so how is that not a relatable experience? Like, it just baffles me. And I don't like the fact that when you're a romance writer, you're kind of seen as maybe not quite a literary writer or whatever. It's like, do you know how hard it is to write romance? Because it's not some kind of like easy art to writing romance, just like it's not an easy art to writing sex, because some people write terrible sex scenes. And I don't like people maligning my genre at all.
No, and not to fall into the trap of suggesting that romance is a malign genre, because we're talking about cross genre in romance. But one of the things that I think that generally causes that is that romance is seen as easy access pornography, and it's not true, particularly in a more modern day audience where we know there is a very great difference between erotica
Yes.
and romance.
Yes.
So if you want
Oh,
to go to
yeah.
Pornhub and watch something where two people are just having sex, that's fine. If you want to go to Amazon and download an erotica book, that's fine. If you go to Amazon and look at romances in, say, let's use something a little bit different, an action genre, you are doing the exact same thing as sitting down and watching a Mission Impossible film.
Yes, exactly.
Like, invariably, Tom Cruise's character gets romantically involved with another character and it influences the plot. You are doing the exact same thing when you read a lot of those stories that can become quite popular. And the only difference between them and a romance is that there is the occasional actual sex scene in a lot of action movies and a lot of... a Top Gun is another perfect example. You could easily turn that to be a little bit more character focused and less on flying, aircraft, and make that is a romance story. His relationship with the Take My Breath Away lady, because I've forgotten what she's called. She that is their love scene. That is a romance. That is their character development and their butting heads against each other and then eventually falling into the sack together is a romance. There's no taking away from that.
No, and I think people like to try and act like that doesn't happen, and it's just anyway,
infuriating.
Yes.
But it is true to say that across most genres you will find there's an element of romance, and I think that's also where you get the satisfaction of writing romances, is because like what Sab was saying, you can pretty much play in any genre and do whatever you want and no one is going to say no or stop you, and more importantly there's going to be the audience
yes.
for it.
Oh, that's very
Because
true.
everyone loves it when things work out for the hero and the heroine.
This is very true. And that's the biggest thing is, I think the difference between calling something a romance, as we all know, is it has to have a happy ever after at the end of the last book if you're writing a series, or at the end of the book. And I think that's where people kind of just don't get it quite. Because I think a lot of the people are like, well, why it's predictable, that they're going to get together at the end. And I just think that that's not quite correct to say it's predictable.
I also think that in crossover genres, that especially if it's a series, what also works is a happily for now.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Especially, I mean, I find that a lot more in crossover genres. Well, a long series, not too long, maybe a trilogy, something. But,
yeah. Sab, you've just made me so happy. You're going to get to the end of my book and you're going to be less angry than I thought you were going to be.
Oh, no. I'm quite...
Oh, no, 100%. Like, I'm so happily for nows. I have happily for nows in my own fantasy romance. So,
Yeah, no.
100%.
Happy for nows I like happy for nows as long as they do end up together in the end. I'm okay with it.
And I think it acknowledges too the idea that in life there are no guarantees.
No.
I think that a lot of romance caters to what was once popular, which was the happily ever after. And you get the idea of the romance fiction genre some 30, and I say 30, but what I really mean is 50 years ago, because when you think about it, the 70s and 80s when Mills and Boon was going absolutely wacko, the idea of a happily ever after was something that a lot of people didn't get to have. The idea now with the relationships metamorphosizing into partners you don't marry until you're in your late 20s or early 30s, and the idea that you can actually choose who you get to marry as opposed to having your parents tell you who you get to marry, means that there is an emerging sense of happy for now. And the idea that happy for now can satisfy as opposed to happily ever after is because a lot of the times we're dumping characters into situations that are beyond their control, and while they can find the resolution they want with their partners, there's often plot devices planned or intended or that will be carried out that ensure enough conflict to remain in the relationship that you can keep carrying the story forward. But it also acknowledges the idea that we know that while we get to choose our partners, not everything always works out the way we plan. It doesn't mean that friends we have or people we know don't get divorced even when they get to choose their partners. The idea of Happy for Now also caters to a certain crowd that wants their binge fests. They want their Netflix series released all at once. They want authors to have 8 books out when they first start up. They want to be able to glut themselves on what they want. And being Happy for Now at least ensures a satisfaction to an extent. It's not guaranteed. And that in itself is kind of alluring too.
I agree, and I also think that the definition of a happy ever after has changed over the last, I guess, 10 years since romance has really become this, well, obviously longer, but romance is now less about books that women read, but they're more, because I have men who read my books, okay? I'm just going to put this point out. And I think that the definition for a happy ever after has changed. And for me, I want a happy ever after that's realistic for the couple. So I don't need marriage and babies. I just need them to be together. And maybe that's my opinion of a happy ever after, or a happy for now. I guess they could both be the same thing. But I think the expectations have adjusted with a more modern audience for what constitutes a happy ever after and what constitutes a happy for now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think you're absolutely right, because it often assumes that a happily ever after would be marriage and kids in a house. And we're more realistic in this day and age, whereas that doesn't always happen for a lot of couples. And that there is more waiting for them out there than they can possibly foresee. And that's a more realistic experience. So giving a happy for now still leaves a lot of friction for you to carry forward into other books, be it with those characters or other characters. But it also is, you're right, much more suited to this day and age.
Yeah, I agree. Not everyone wants to get married. Not everyone wants to have babies. So why can't we cater to those people? I think that's the biggest revolution in romance that we're trying to cater for, and especially genre crossover, is we're catering for a more modern audience with our books. I think. I don't know if anyone agrees with that.
Well,
no, I agree.
I agree. I know that I am notorious for harassing Sarah all the time about giving me a happily ever after. No matter what you write, give me a happily ever after. And I want all the babies and I want all the marriages.
Yes.
However, I harass her. And do you know what it is? It's because I love Sarah's books, but also because I can actually contact her. I can't contact other authors that I absolutely love, but I can harass her. But no, as much as I love marriage and babies in books and happy ever after, I'm more than happy to have just the main characters end up together and profess their love for one another, and that be that. I do have books that I have loved where it's just been that. So I'm not like gonna, beat my chest and be like, no, I need the marriage and the babies no matter what. I think I just love to tease Sarah, and because I know that somewhere, she'll
yeah, but you also know that I'll ignore you and harass me over the marriage and babies, because I'm just going to write the characters that I want. She keeps it. No, because Sab's my critique partner. She gets to do all of my books pretty much as we go.
Your critique partner gets to make all the demands they like. I've had several critique partners. Jen is one, and she was amazing. Heather is another, and she makes me do what I should be doing, which is a better job.
Yes.
And I think that the great thing about your critique partner is not just showing you where you're doing wrong, because we all invariably make mistakes,
yes,
but also where you're doing right, where you're really doing well, where you get that desperation from the reader. Oh, I want to see this person with this person. I want to see this couple say I love you. I want to see this couple get married. I want to see this couple have a baby. And those relationships, depending on what you're doing with the story, you're evoking the emotion of your reader to want those things for characters.
Yes.
These are invisible people you have made up. They are fictional. They are only in your head. And if you've managed to evoke from someone that response, you know you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
As a writer, it's often very difficult to know whether or not you're doing the right thing. And I think that's a very, very indicative sign. And it's one of the reasons that I actually like how fluid the romance genre can be, because you don't have to give any one of those things. It really depends on the characters and where they are in the story and what's happening with the plot. And you can give these things almost like a level reward for characters. Like it depends on what each of them want and what each of them reveal what they want over the course of the story itself, which builds upon not only that character development, not only that plot, but what the reader wants out of that experience as well.
Exactly, yeah.
I agree, definitely. The next question I have is, when we're writing genre crossover romance, how big is the focus of the romance in your plot?
Ooh.
Good question. I'm a bit of a slow burn fan, I have to confess. Writers are going to discover this anyway, reading Queen of Spades. But I really like romances where you often have characters who, and this is just a pet peeve of mine, it is not necessary for all people, all genres, or all women, but a pet peeve of mine is two characters getting physically intimate and then one of them turning around and going, no, we can't, insert plot device here. And I sit there and go, it doesn't take that much to actually, bang, okay? You can go ahead and do that. There's not that much involved. And one of the things that I like about the slower burn, which is what I've tried to do, is that quite often people will look at one another and go, hey, I kind of like you, and there'll be that kind of, hey, I kind of like you too. But they're not mind readers. They don't know what's going through the other person's head. They don't know why they might get closer or might pull further away. And I like playing with that dynamic as far as I possibly can, because it's more realistic. You don't often have people in real life actually get too intimate before one of them says, no, we have to stop. And there's an actual reason behind it that is that's believable, that's relatable, that's something that's real. Quite often, I know that one of the authors that I've read, oh goodness, that's terrible. I've forgotten her name. Isn't that awful? One of the writers that I read does actually do that in one particular story, and the reason that I found that she gave was quite was very plot driven and not convincing. I think that if you have characters who get physically intimate together and then choose not to go ahead for whatever reason, it needs to be a good reason. It needs to be something that's believable to the reader, because otherwise they're missing out on that satisfaction. And when you have slow burn, you absolutely want to make sure that there's that valid reason for not finishing the act, as it were.
That's definitely something I agree with, especially in slow burn. Well, in romance in general, I think it's you have to have good reasonings why characters can't be together or can't continue in a relationship, and that's one of my pet peeves, is the miscommunication trope.
Love that. That's great. Don't use it at all.
No, like it's just I don't mind it, like if it's like a small thing that happens maybe 1 or 2 chapters, but if it's like the entire book, it's like, what? No, just no.
Like any trope, okay, you can use it to an extent. It's a stereotype. It's a conformity that it's a trick.
Yes.
It is a trick you can use to heighten sexual tension, and you can't use it more than once. It's like watching a magician perform the same trick over and again. You're going to sit there and go, you know what, I've actually this out and you're not funny anymore.
Exactly. I definitely agree.
So I guess I'll answer the question on my part. Right, so I guess this one's a little bit hard for me to answer, I guess. Mainly because with my fantasy romance, a lot of my characters are all it's all forbidden romance, I guess. Not your kind of forbidden romance, Sarah, because I know you've got this.
Let's not go into that.
But I mean more like enemies to lovers.
Yes.
So there's
Love it.
there is this sexual tension, and there is the whole, what I like to call, a Sherlock Moriarty kind of flirtation going on. Which I love, especially I think in my first book, because they're from 2 different classes and it just can't happen, but they have history, so we want to see it happen. But for the rest of the series, I think it is I want to say it's slow burn. I can't actually think of my characters just diving straight into sex and then saying, sorry, we can't do this anymore. I think that's quite frustrating for me, because I quite enjoy seeing character development and seeing a relationship grow. And basically, I ship characters straight away. I won't dive into that. That's a different discussion. But I really, there's something about learning about two characters and seeing how they are together and believing in their growing relationship and romance, and really want them together, even if it's just a kiss. I think from a kiss you crave so much more after, especially a build up to a kiss. You just, I don't know, there's something really special about it. And I would never write characters just, I think, from the get-go. I think I've seen on Twitter quite a lot where writers ask this question to the Twitterverse as to whether it's appropriate to have like two characters dive to sex straight away from the first chapter. And I think there's so many different views about that. I think in some respect it just kind of separates the reader from these characters. You don't actually get that. You don't see that growth.
No, I agree completely, and I think that if you have characters who have, okay, so to backtrack just a little, I love the forbidden romance aspect, and that is one of the forbidden romance that actually does work with the whole non-consummation at the start, because what you end up having is this situation where they can't get caught, but they're still attracted to each other, and that is more than a plot device. I remember me reading a romance where two characters were practically dry humping each other and then decided not to go ahead, and I'm like, at that point in the physical relationship, all you're doing, and excuse the language, is all you're doing is cock blocking. That's really what you are doing here, and that is not satisfying. When you have two characters who finally give in to their attraction and they kiss and then they draw away because someone else comes along, that is different, because that is a forbidden romance and that is not part of it. That is not that there is a very big difference between two characters kissing and drawing away from one another because somebody else comes along or because it's forbidden or you have something else going on, and two characters getting way too physical to the point where you expect something to happen and to them draw away from each other because they say, oh, but we shouldn't. Yes, they damn well should turn around and start writing sonnets to each other. And that is where you get different tension from, which is what you always want to do when you're writing stories. You want to create tension. Whether you're writing a story that's plot and character related, and whether or not you're writing a story that has sex in it, both still carry the element of tension. And that's what you're trying to create. It's what you're trying to build upon. And the same way an actual orgasm works, you want to build the story up, particularly a long story, until you get to the point where everything is happening, including the climax of the book and the climax between the two characters, because let's be frank, we're talking about sex. And I think characters that jump into sex during the first scene are doing what we were talking about earlier, which was serving a certain service to readers. They're like, here's some pornography. You can go to Pornhub and get a visual, or you can read this book, and it caters to a certain genre as opposed to just being two people on a bed. It does certainly cater more towards sexual fantasy as opposed to an emotional and mental connection you have to those characters.
I agree.
Although I have read books where that does actually work, but hey, it's all about the scene. It's all about the writing.
I've read books and liked them, and it's really bugging me now. I can't think of the author who does that, and it annoys me because I've read her other stuff and been overwhelmingly aroused by what she's done. But I just found the one instance where she did do it, and I've seen other authors do it, and they go, "No, we shouldn't because you are the chosen one," and I'm just like, "Oh, piss off! No, I'm sorry. Just get it on, all right? Just do the thing. Do the things. It's what we all want to see, and you're only kidding yourselves that you're not going to end up together at this point in time. You pulling each other away for another 5,000 words is a waste of my goddamn time."
God, no, that annoys me. That really annoys me. I'm just like, why? When there's no reason for the characters not to get it on, I'm just like, can you just not?
Or
can you just get on with it?
Like, it's not a case of not.
You've already,
it's
like you've already done it, and now you're like, no, and but why?
Tab A, plot B, people. You don't need an instruction manual at this point in time.
Yes, you've already gone there.
And my husband's laughing in the background.
But you've already gone there. You know how it works. Why are you lying?
Yep.
Drives me
Yep.
nuts.
Yes.
Okay.
Was there another
Yes.
question?
Okay, here we go. Can we talk about the importance of world building within the not romance, but obviously within the genre crossovers? Well, in romance as well.
I think it's just
Yeah.
as important as the character development. I think it's just as important as anything that you write. Anything that you write needs to do a very, very fundamental thing.
Mhm.
It needs to remove the reader from their reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if it's an action flick for some guy who just wants to veg out during his lunch break. It doesn't matter if it's for a horny housewife who's sitting at home and needs 5 minutes to herself. It is an escape. It is a chance to remove oneself from the world that they're currently in and watch it like their own internal TV movie with their own internal cast. And let's face it, we've all wanted to cast our own internal movies. And it gives you the chance to sit there and, more importantly, be absorbed by what's happening. And you can't do that if you aren't character developing, if you aren't world building, if you aren't pulling the reader into your story and making them care more about what happens next than the cup of tea they've left by their side. You want that cup of tea to go cold. You want them to forget about their coffee or their glass of wine or the fact that they were supposed to go do something in 20 minutes. You want them to think twice about whether or not they take the book to the toilet with them. You want them to fall into your world, and you can't do that unless you can draw them in. And world building is a cornerstone of doing this.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
It's
Well
all this
building.
agreeing that you're doing.
Yeah, I know.
One of the things that I have, I obviously love world building, and one of the things that I hate to talk about my gripes about these things, but
Oh, go on, do it. I won't judge you.
well, I hate info dumping for obvious reasons. But I find that when we're doing in a lot of genre crossovers that or some of them I've read, there is a hell of a lot of info dumping within the first kind of few chapters, and I'm just like, I don't care. Like, I don't care about this world. You haven't given me any reason to care about this world, because all you've done is write a description about it, and I'm like, that's not how you do world building.
No, for me, that's purely a developmental edit. Right? You either have written enough stories, you know how to write a good story and not do that, or you're a novice who hasn't had a decent developmental editor showing you that you're really a naughty girl who needs to learn how to do it properly. And I think that one of the key things that a lot of particularly self-published authors is they lack a developmental editor who's willing to tell them that truth. And for every writer, it's different. For every writer, there is a flaw that they indulge in that they think is a style, and it's not a style, it is a flaw, and they need to work to improve it. They need to work to make it better. And often, excuse my dog whining in the background for pats. Shut up, you little monster. Yes, okay, here you go, I'll pat you. Sorry if you can hear my dog whining in the background. He's sitting here wanting to go walks, but it was raining all day today, and it's currently 8 o'clock at night, so he's not going for a walk now. Are you, you little wretch? No, you're not. So I think a lot of the reasons why that you do get those, developmental edit problems is because a lot of writers want to say, here is my world, it's complicated, I need to tell you all about it before you can really set into the scene. And I think one of the things that you can best learn from a proper developmental edit is how to introduce a very textured and interesting and layered world, which could be well worth becoming immersed into, is how to gradually introduce that. And any story writing, be it romance or any other genre, needs to introduce that gradually and carefully in order to properly engage the reader. But more importantly, there are many fundamental parts of stories that engage people to read them, and more often than not, people are inclined to believe that these rest on two different things, that is plot and character, and it's really not. It's more like plot, character, world building, and quite often underneath it, the romance. Now, I know that we talked about romance earlier and about how you can see it in every different sort of plot, but basically a lot of what our personal drive is, and it comes down to id. I remember reading years ago, as part of a university lecture I went to, what it is that motivates people to do what they want to do, and to their actions is wanting to belong, wanting to have resources like food and shelter and warmth, but also wanting to partner with someone. And I think that a lot of the time, the most harmful thing that's demeaned by people about the romance genre is that idea you need to procreate, you need to be with someone. There's a biological urge there to do that, and it does end up becoming one of those 4 fundamentals writing a story, which is characters and who they are, and learning to love them and hate them and feel about them, which is the author's responsibility. But the plot, what makes them do those things, what influences them, what's really going on. And as a role player, and I mean for gaming like D&D, except not D&D because I hate D&D, that plot is really important because it decides a lot of that stuff. And then you have these other aspects to it, which is world building, where you're actually placing everything, and what's motivating you to do these things, which is part of your id.
So I have a confession. This series, this pirate fantasy romance, initially had been published back, I think, it escapes me, 2018 maybe, and it was absolutely disgraceful. I will say. I'll tell you why it was disgraceful, and I'll tell you why it's off market.
Oh, go on.
It was my first draft, and I had no editor. I had no guidance. I had no one to say, "Do not pass go." I had no one to pull me back and basically say, "This is a mess." And on the plus side, I started working on the second book, and I actually found my second editor. Absolutely fantastic. And I somehow, or rather, ended up with 2 editors who were both really fantastic. And I decided to put this book out and rewrite it. And one of the most important thing about it was that it was absolutely messy, because I had multiple beliefs and religions flying about the place. I had like modern day references set in which was not our world, which didn't make sense. And then what else? Listen, I don't even into it, but it was a mess. And I think gradually since then, I have learnt a lot about world building, and I absolutely adore world building, and I know the importance of it. And info dumping is one of the things I used to do really bad. So Sarah, you would have absolutely adored it.
I don't deplore a book. It's just that
you would have absolutely adored
okay.
it.
I might like
You would have gone on Goodreads. You would have given it 1 star. You would have written an essay.
Okay, I don't applaud books because of bad world building. I don't put it down because of that info dumping, but it does annoy me. And I just like to add, it is not just indie publishers that have bad world building. I have read many books that are additionally published that have awful world building that is info bumpy and drives me nuts. So we'll just put that out there.
I think it's worth me saying now that this is one of the things that I've learned from, and I have greatly and massively improved, and completely reined back. So, and I'm just so happy that I have a fantastic editor who is very, very great at developmental editing, as EJ has out. So I'm happy. It's very, very important, especially when doing crossover genre. So, yes.
No, absolutely. I'm very, very inclined to agree. I think that world building, particularly in romance, often you're trying to sell the story. You're trying to create something, and whenever you're trying to do that creation, one of the things that always comes about is the fundamentals I was talking about before, which is the characters, the plot, world building, and of course the romance. And I think that when you think about those 4 key things, quite often the first thing we tend to jump to is trying to make the reader understand where they are, what they're looking at. And I always forget this word. I can't tell you how much it annoys me that I always forget this word. But there's a word to describe when a reader is reading a scene. They will do this psychological function inside of their heads, which automatically paints a scene for them. So if you turn around and say you enter a library, you can get a very interesting array of scenes that are automatically envisaged by the reader, but quite often we're dealing with far more complex subjects. So the idea of being able to place people in the scenery becomes important. And I think a writer's craft is really developed when they can turn around and introduce that setting without info dumping, which some people are better than others. I don't mind a little info dumping, but I'm a very, very flexible reader because I have read a lot of indie authors where they've not had access to a good and thorough developmental editor. So that's something I'm much more forgiving on when I'm reviewing. It's when a writer will go on for a page or more of info dumping, that I'll start to go, okay, that's too much, and you should know better, and you should have had this developmental edited to be scaled very far down than what you've done.
Yeah, I agree. That's completely what I don't mind if it's like a paragraph or something explaining something so that it makes sense. But when it becomes like pages and pages, why? What relevance does this actually have? I want to see what the characters are doing, or I want to see some action.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the idea of getting immediate satisfaction from certain things, I think that a lot of writers will often present quite a wonderful scene. So
Yeah.
there's a book I don't talk about very often when I talk about books that info dump. I remember reading a book that was from quite a prolific Twitter author who had a very fascinating idea. And one of the things that I disliked about it quite a lot, and I felt took away from his agency, his character agency, but also the led me to believe he hadn't had that developmental edit was because he didn't info dump at the start. He info dumped further into the story, and it didn't go on for 1 or 2 pages. It would go on for 6 pages.
Oh my god.
And I wasn't reading on my phone, I was reading on my tablet, and I'd be like, this is like reading Herodotus. Now, not many people know this, but I actually have a bachelor's degree in ancient history and archaeology, and I spent a lot of my time reading from a writer, if you know history, called Herodotus. And Herodotus has this terrible habit of going completely off topic into a little niche of history that was otherwise fascinating but not remotely relevant to what he was talking about. And I find that writers who haven't had a good developmental editor won't just do this at the start. They'll do this throughout the entire story. And I don't like judging them for it, but I think they need to be, because that stuff is interesting to fans. That stuff is relevant to people who love what you've created. But if this is your first book, you don't have fans. You don't have people who care about that stuff. That stuff is things you put as excerpts and short stories on your website in order to draw more people interested in the world building that you've done. The information that you're relaying when thinking about that sort of stuff drags the story down. And it's one of the most touchy subjects, because it's a question of, are you taking away from the original voice, or are you info dumping? And more often than not, particularly when authors fight over it, is that you're info dumping and you're just not ready to acknowledge that.
Definitely, I agree.
I have a question for both.
Okay.
How do you both feel about authors putting in glossaries? So descriptions of terms and, I don't know, characters in the beginning of the book. You know, like, have you ever read a book, a crossover genre, where they have like maybe 6 pages at the beginning of the book that is literally like a dictionary of different like species, terms to help you understand certain languages that they talk about? Because I've read a few books like that, which I can appreciate. However, what I find is that when I'm reading the book, I often forget what these things are, because whilst I'm reading it, I don't want to have to leave the page that I'm reading to go back to the glossary at the beginning of the book and be like, what's that word and what does it mean? And because often what happens is the author doesn't, in that scene, they forget to explain what this is, and it kind of like pulls me out of the story completely.
Okay, I'm going to give you the author who has done this perfectly. There is only one author I've ever found that has done this perfectly.
I think I know who.
Is it J.R. Ward in the Black
It's
Jacket Brotherhood?
definitely
Yes,
J.R.
that,
Ward.
that
She-
queen. Yes,
She's
that
brilliant.
queen.
She's
Yeah,
fantastic.
no, she is brilliant, and she has done exactly what you've described, which is that she has an ancient vampire brotherhood who use a lot of thug-like language, but they also drop a lot of their ancestral habits into the story, and it can be quite weird reading it, but it flows incredibly well. Having the index there, or the glossary at the start of the book, certainly helps identify with all the different terminology that she's using very quickly and very easily. And I think that if anybody is going to be using a glossary for world building, if they write romance or not, J.R. Ward nails it. She is the person out there, when you're talking about nailing it, who has done the cake as it should be made. She has managed to get that terminology and those words and those references that don't make sense and insert them rather seamlessly. But by the same token, she also puts in this glossary so that if you turn around and get lost at any point in time, and because it's an ongoing series, which means that there are a lot of characters, and there is a lot of character development across the series. Even though each book features one couple, you often find terms that we used early in the series that don't come back until later in the series. And when you come back to it, you're just like, wait, what was this? And the glossary is there for you. So I really believe in a well-used glossary, and I think that any writer who wants to do that really needs to borrow from the way J.R. Ward has done it. Not just by reading, not just by looking at what she's done, but actually reading her novels to understand how she's done it.
Yeah, I think it's she does it so well that it just frustrates me in other books that I've read where I feel like a glossary is necessary because the author's not done a great job at explaining things to me. So what will happen is I'm reading and I'm in this world and I feel like a foreigner. I feel like they're speaking another language and I have no idea what they're saying and I'm completely lost. And nobody's asking the question of what is it that you said. So it's kind of like I feel really lost and I really appreciate a glossary, but it's not there. It's kind of painful and it's really upsetting for me because I feel really separate from the story. It really kind of makes me put it down and just. But no, Sarah, honestly, you need to read Jail.
Yeah, no, you've told me that, and I will. I just not been in the mood for paranormal romance.
This is true. No, it's true.
Okay, let me just say this. I'm a mood reader.
Okay, all right, let me put this into perspective for you. I was told, I think back in the early noughties, oh god, I'm old. I was told back in the noughties to start reading the J.R. Ward series because it was hot. And I wasn't that keen on it. I didn't actually start doing it until the late noughties. And I don't regret that because I am a bit of a binge reader. But one of the things that I really, really liked about what J.R. Ward had created was the continuity. I always felt like I got a happy for now. There was no happily ever after because she presented a broad band of brothers, not of blood but of arms. And the way that she presented the first brother that got together, the vampire king, he resembled the cream of the crop, as it were. And it was very, very hard to look at that and think, well, how can it get better from this? Except by the time I finished reading the first book in the series, it was not. And this is where I think romance is really unnecessarily criticized by people who've never been in love. I really felt that by the time I'd finished reading the first book in that series, I was ready for the rest of the brothers, and their romance was of no lesser value just because they weren't king. The one thing that I loved about this paranormal romance was that there was a host of guys out there, all with different tastes, all with different styles, all with different possibilities. And the possibilities is what really, really drew me into that series. And I have to confess, I have read, I think I've read John's story is the last story I'm up to. And there are a lot of different characters, different kinks, and different things going on. Oh, yeah,
There's a lot.
But reading it and loving it was more about the character development of it. The Black Dagger Brotherhood represents probably one of the best character developments that I've ever seen. I think the only person who does it better or does it as well is Cresley Cole. Actually, she was the author I was thinking about before. Cresley Cole writes a series called Mortals After Dark, and she does a similar thing. She ends up during a single romance introducing a swathe of characters who you end up finding out their romances too. And that's what, for me, makes a really good romance series. It's not just about the two main characters who you obviously want to see get together. It's also about the characters they meet along the way who help them with their journey, who you also want to see get to a happy ending. So I can completely understand needing to be in the right frame of mind for the Black Dagger Brotherhood, and it certainly is a very vicious series, but as a darker writer, like I like to think of myself as a much more sinister, darker writer, I really got into that series, and I really thought that while they use all these whacked gangster terms, that it had a lot to offer once you move past the way they spoke to one another.
Yeah. I will. It is on my list of things to read. It's just I'm not got around to it.
Yeah, I mean, Cresley Cole, J.R. Ward. I've got many others that I know that probably I've told Sarah about 2 years ago when I first met her. So I know 100% they're on.
Yes, I know. I'm just not been in a paranormal romance reading mood like for a while.
There are way more romance authors than we will ever be able to read, including ourselves.
Exactly. And because I've been like very focused on like all my contemporary stuff at the moment, that's the kind of what I've been reading. Some people advocate that you shouldn't read a genre writing in, and I'm like, you can just shut up, because I don't agree with that.
No, I don't think so too. I know that when I was writing Queen of Spades, I was actually reading. It was 4 years ago. So I was doing two things. I was watching Killjoys, I was watching Dark Matter, and I was reading Anna Guire's series with Samantha Jacks. So it's not one of her more commonly known series, but is certainly one of the better sci-fi series that I ever read, and it convinced me that I could write a science fiction romance, because it wasn't. I'll put it to you like this. I never read romance. I thought I was one of those horrible people who thought it was a trash genre that was not worthy of my intellectual mind. Yes, I'm a heinous asshole. I said it. There you go. So I had a friend who dragged me to the Melbourne CBD occasionally, and she said to me, I need to go to my romance bookstore to pick up my romance book. And I'm like, oh, okay, whatever you. And it was a very cruel and hurtful thing for me to think, but when she took me there, I was actually kind of amused at all of the books that I saw. And this was a long time ago. To put it in perspective, this is probably 17 years ago. So it was a very, very long time. And I remember walking around the bookstore and picking up a few different books, one of which was the cover was what grabbed me. It was A Girl's Guide to Vampire. It had a picture of a woman whose neck was exposed and there was a band-aid on it. And it was by Katie McAllister, and that was probably, if you haven't read Katie McAllister and you want to read a really good comedic story but also with really hot romance, I really recommend Katie McAllister. But one of the other books that I came across was this book by Anna Guire, and it was this sci-fi romance, and I thought, oh, I've always loved sci-fi, and that was back when Battlestar Galactica was coming out, and I was never a Star Trekkie, but I love my sci-fi.
Yeah.
And she wrote this series that was far more, Anna Guire wrote this series that was far more plot driven, that was romance. She probably only had a couple of sex scenes every book, if that. And one of the reasons that I liked it was because it was more character driven. It was aggressively character driven. And at the same time, I'd just been working on my fantasies. I told people that I was a writer. And this is where my actual dedication comes from, Queen of Spades.
Oh yes.
Oh yes, that dedication. Yeah, I'm talking about that dedication. So for listeners to the show, that dedication is to non-toxic men and how much I love them. And I think that they are actually sexy as fuck, because men who are not toxic and who care about women matter, and they matter a whole lot more than we give them credit for. Men who come up to me and tell me that if I'm a writer, I need to write sex because it sells, piss me off.
Oh God, yes.
And that is a very light term for how they make me feel. So the book is definitely not dedicated to those assholes.
No.
They can take a giant fucking hike. Oh, there I did it. I dropped an F-bomb.
It's
I'm
all
sorry,
good.
you might have to mute that out. But anyway.
No, we love an F-bomb.
Anyway, but yes, Anna Guire wrote this really, really good series that made me absolutely that you could write romance and that it could be more character and plot driven than it was romantically, but it could still be a romance story. And this is the thing that I find about a lot of the whole romance genre, is that there is no romance genre. There's just books that have brought up the importance of these connections we have to other people and how much they dominate our lives, and people are willing to be open and public about those connections. People are willing to actually say, hey, I have a connection to you. I'm attracted to you. There is something more to us than sex. And that is what I actually like about romance. It's not, oh yes, our biology is compatible. It is I feel and they feel back.
Exactly, that is exactly how I feel about romance too. Like, to me, I'm like, yeah, sex is great and all, but if I don't understand why the characters are together, then I'm not gonna like it.
No, and this is what annoys me about the down. And I'm sure that's like, the topic was originally supposed to be about cross-genre, and I think that that's an important thing to raise alongside the importance of romance, is because quite often the idea of romance playing a dominant role in any story is put to the side as superfluous, it's put to the side as unnecessary, and it's side as catering to basic instincts. But the idea of belonging to one person, to having someone love you enough to marry you or have your children, is completely and utterly underestimated. And I don't see it as helpful when people turn around and say that romance is a genre that is unrealistic and trash and not worthy, because romance is in every genre. Romance is a dominant force that can't be stopped, it can't be contained, and you can't pretend that it doesn't matter. And above all, it is not about sex. It is about our emotional connection to another person.
Exactly. And just because there's some sex in it doesn't mean that it's not about an emotional connection.
Let's be honest, we all like a side of
Yes. Well, let's be honest, Sarah likes a big side of sex with her. In fact, funny enough, we were talking about this in the...
Are we measuring in inches?
Yeah.
What's going on here?
Well, we'll talk about like 10 inches. No, I'm not. No. No. We were talking about this actually in our podcast. I said when I started reading, when I started getting into romance, I used to be like very innocent, and I was like, oh no.
Sorry, I'll
really
stop laughing
it is
in a
funny,
second.
but it is funny because when I started reading romance, it was historical romance, because my aunt writes those, and so those are very, very sweet and innocent, and no, there's no sex, there's kissing, yeah, but nasty, okay. And then I started to get into like
It's kissing and the scene fades and it all goes
Yeah.
black, and 3 months later she turns around and goes, "Oh no, I'm pregnant."
I never had any of that. It was more like upper class, like Regency romance. But anyway, let's skip over that. And then I started reading like I was very much into like fantasy, but with romance. And the first time I ever read like an actual proper sex scene was in fantasy, and I was like, "Whoa, what is this?" Like, I was like a teenager at this point, and I was like, obviously I knew what sex was, and I was like, I was not expecting there to be sex in it, and now I'm like complete opposite, and I'm like, give me all the sex, but give me the relationship as well. Like I don't read erotica because there's no romance in erotica. I'm just going to put that out there, and I need romance, but I also like to have the arousing parts in it as well. So I'm just going to be honest about that. No, I don't think there's any shame in it.
No, and there's not any shame in having that easy access to effectively what floats your boat, for want of a lack of a better term. But I think that it's true too that when you go to use any form of entertainment, there is a goal and there is an outcome. When you go to read a book, when you go to watch a movie, when you go to play a game, you want to cater to what it is that you want based on your personality, be it fantasy, sci-fi, contemporary, action. You know, people playing Call of Duty for hours on end never cease to amaze me, except I remember the days where I would play Counter-Strike with uni buddies until all hours of the morning. And I think the thing about romance is that you can have clean romance, but it only ever presents the possibility of a climax, not the climax itself. Whereas in romance, what you want to clean romance versus romance is what you want is that final getting together, which represents something different. And that difference is the first time.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the first time that characters have sex, it's the first time they're together, which is a very raw and honest moment between two characters and two people, a matter of fact. And how that plays out matters deeply because, as many of us can attest, those first times with a new partner can often be messy, unsatisfactory, and awkward, unbelievably awkward. And what we represent is not where it goes wrong, but where it goes right. Very few of us get to do or have the chance to make it work out just right.
Yeah.
And I think that all the ways that it can go possibly wrong represent a fear, embarrassment, but also a sense of demeaning within ourselves. We can think that we've done something wrong. We can think that we're somehow have failed. Whereas couples who can do that successfully and do it well reassure us that it can happen. So there's a different element of fantasy at play there when you represent two couples who can come together and have it work. But more importantly, this is incredibly personal, but I believe that it can happen. I believe that two people can get together for the first time and have it work. And the reason I know that is because I'm not or wasn't originally a person who was interested in one sexual partner, but the first guy I actually slept with ended up becoming my husband, and it was because I trusted him and we got along, and it worked out really, really well. And I think romance represents that.
Yeah.
And the reason that I believe in it is because it did work. It worked for me. And that's why I think it's important. And I think that people who undervalue it are basically doing so because they've not had that, which is, it's not anything to be embarrassed about or anything to be ashamed about or even anything to be angry about. It just represents a chance that they didn't have. And there's no reason to be aggressive to other people because it wasn't your chance.
No, I totally agree. And I think that sex is not in books isn't really, to me, it's never been like arousing, although that's a side element of it, but I think like you said, it represents the time a couple coming together, and you can see that emotional connection, and that's what I find the most interesting about, which might come as a surprise to people. I find the emotional connection between the two characters is the most of the scene, not the actual act itself. Like, and I think that's something that I very much say about, like, I might write sex heavy books, but I don't put sex scenes in for no reason. There is always, a reason why they would be having that moment together. And I think that people don't see that. I hate people referring to romance as smut, because I don't think it is. And I think that devalues the genre by calling that, actually.
No, absolutely. I think that's where that's why there's been a growing distinction between romance and erotica, because romance has a plot, erotica does not. Erotica is just sex, and I think that's cruel in some regards to erotica too, because erotica still has more plot than watching a pornographic video off Pornhub or RedTube or any of those things, and I think that also devolves down to engagement.
Mm-hmm.
The primary audience that we're seeking to please are women.
Yes.
Or sensitive men, because I do know men that do read romance, and I think that more often than not, it's also about age. I find that the younger a man is, the more inclined he is to just watch those things, as opposed to the older a man is, the more inclined he is to want the plot as well. He wants the actual, the emotional engagement as well, and I think that's because men develop the emotional maturity to have that. And one of the things that really annoys me about this genre is that men can't have that emotional maturity. I think that's wrong to think that. I think that there are a lot of men out there that need the respect of having that they possess that emotional maturity, that they can connect to women and not on a physical level. And it's one of the things that I love about romance, that it encourages that. But in erotica too, I think that while there's some books that are just sex, that's all they are, and that's what they're there for. They're there to be an erotic read and to have fun and to do exactly what the amateurs have done on the Pornhub. But I think there's erotica out there, and I'll mention one author in particular, Harley Leroux. She does it very, very well. She manages to include in her erotic stories a sense of character and a sense of agency. And while there is not so much of a plot, which is what differentiates a romance from an erotica, there is absolutely character development. There is absolutely the growth and the emotional maturity that you kind of want. And then there is the joyous and very outbound satisfaction of what it is that she's creating erotica herself. Yes. So I think that you often get that range, and that's true, right from very clean, no kissing, barely even hand-holding romances that cater to people who are after a purely emotional connection, and they just want love, and they just want marriage, and they just want kids, and all those things that we are taught that we should want, right down to the women, the people who write the filthy books that cater to fetishes and desires and deviancy that lurks in our darkest hearts. That they're still catering to the same thing.
Yes.
The way that they do it is just different.
No, I agree completely.
By the way,
thank you. I will walk out of this interview.
All the while, I'll be like thinking in my head, I just love I love Phil. Please, I need the comfort that the characters give as well. I need him to spoon her after. Like, I want there to be pillow talk, please.
Oh my god, Phil. It's hilarious. Like, Sab comes out, well, because obviously she's my and she's like, give me all the filth. Then give me the nice scenes at the end. And then there was this, I know this is completely off topic. There was this one scene that I wrote in a book recently where we had talked about this quite a lot, because it was quite it was a very kinky scene, but it was also because his character was extremely slow burn romance. And I was like, I don't know if I was scared about writing it because it was this big occasion. And then when I finally presented, she goes, I really loved all the filth, but I'm so glad that at the end she kind of says to him, you know, you can do all this stuff to me, but please afterwards just hold me and show me that you care about me. And I was just like, and Sab goes, I loved that, and that was my favorite thing. And I was like, I was all, you know, in awe of the fact that I'd managed it. But I just think, you know, you can have all this like super kinky sex, but then you need to have the characters show that they love each other or they care about each other afterwards.
Yeah.
I think that represents something that's deeply feminine, and I think it's something that it's represented in particularly the BDSM community, which is the terminology around what you're talking about, the pillow talk and all that, is called aftercare. And women often feel in a position whereby they're used. They are something to work out frustrations on. They are something to enjoy. They are something that is temporary. Yeah. And I think aftercare represents something beyond that. I think aftercare represents something that promises people, that promises women, promises partners, whatever their sexuality, that they are more than what they've been used for.
Yes.
And the reason that that's important is because the way we feel about sex and the way we feel about how we have sex, and regardless of the level of deviancy, if you will, in that particular genre, is that people want to know, women want to know that they're worth more than a receptacle.
Yes.
They're worth more than a machine that spits out babies. They're worth more than someone who stays at home and gets the chores done. They are valued and attractive and worth more. And that is why, no matter the genre, no matter the level of sex in the story, that aftercare is important, because what it represents is a value beyond those things. And I think a lot of women feel like that the way that they judge men is not on the sex. The way they judge men is on their level of aftercare. And it's a horrible thing to judge men on, except it's what many of us are raised doing. And I think that that is changing, but I also think that society's expectation on women and the way that women look and the way that women dress and the way that women appear is valued on what men think of them.
Yes.
So that when you have sex with the said man, how you're treated afterwards is not a judgment on the woman. It is a judgment on the man and his value. And so romance gets quite a lot of the cream of its crop, as it were, from that aftercare. It's not about the act itself, which can be hotter than the flames of hell. It is about the comfort afterwards, and then that becomes the emotional connection.
That's so true. And I've actually wrote a man's part, he loves sex, but actually his favorite part about it is afterwards when he's with cuddling his lady. And I just thought that was really sweet, and that made me swoon.
No, and I think that there are a lot of men like that. I think that and this is one of the reasons why my book is devoted to these non-toxic men, is because there are so many men out there.
Yes.
There are so many men out there who do care, who don't, you know, maybe they've got certain predilections that involve, you know, fantasies of women or what they want or what their women partners want. But at the end of the day, if you have a partner who can sit there and be more worried about whether or not you enjoyed yourself, whether or not you had a good time, whether or not you feel taken care of, you found yourself a very good partner. And I think that there are a lot of men out, there's far more men out there that do this than the genre or even the more cynical of men and women give credit for.
Okay, so firstly, I'd like to thank EJ for coming on the show, because it's been a very interesting conversation we've had. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, EJ.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a really, really good discourse. I've really your lovely ladies' company.
Thank you. Okay, guys, so that was the Made in Romance pod, and we will see you again very soon. So goodbye for now.
Catch you later.